The dust cloud rose like smoke from hell itself, and through it came the howling pack, 6 hunting dogs with murder in their eyes, closing in on a woman who had nowhere left to run. What happened next in that desolate canyon would change too. Lives forever, but the real story began 3 months earlier, when Cassandra Mitchell made a choice that would cost her everything she thought she knew about the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the red rocks of Cedar Ridge, Arizona, in shades of copper and gold when the accusations first started flying. Cassandra Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching her husband's truck disappear down the winding dirt road that led to his construction job in town. She had no idea. It would be the last normal moment of her life. Thomas Mitchell had been acting strange for weeks. Coming home late, smelling of whiskey and cheap perfume, his eyes holding secrets that made Cassandra's stomach turn. But she'd learned long ago not to ask questions that might provoke his temper. In their 5 years of marriage, she'd mastered the art of invisible living, keeping the house spotless, dinner ready, and her thoughts to herself. The first stone crashed through their front window at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon. Cassandra knew the time because she'd been staring at the old grandfather clock, wondering if Thomas would remember it was their anniversary. The sound of shattering glass sent her heart racing as she rushed to see what had happened. Outside, Martha Hendricks stood with her arms crossed, her weathered face twisted with righteous fury. Behind her, a small crowd had gathered, neighbors Cassandra had known for years, their expressions ranging from disgust to barely contained rage. "Come out here, you shameful woman." Martha's voice cut through the desert air like a whip. "Come out and face what you've done." Cassandra's hands trembled as she unlatched the door. She'd known Martha since moving to Cedar Ridge, had brought her casseroles when her husband died, had helped her with grocery shopping when arthritis made it difficult. Now the elderly woman looked at her like she was something that had crawled out from under a rock. "Mrs. Hendricks, I don't understand. What's wrong?" "Don't you dare play innocent with me, Cassandra Mitchell. We all know what you've been up to while your husband's been working his fingers to the bone to provide for you." The words hit like physical blows. Cassandra felt the blood drain from her face as the crowd murmured agreement. Bob Peterson, who ran the general store, shook his head in disgust. Sarah Chun, her closest neighbor, wouldn't even meet her eyes. "I honestly don't know what you're talking about," Cassandra managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Martha reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled photograph, holding it up like evidence in a trial. Even from the doorway, Cassandra could see it was her, sitting in the cab of a pickup truck with someone, their faces close together, appearing intimate. The world seemed to tilt. Cassandra recognized the truck immediately. It belonged to Jake Morrison, Thomas's business partner. But the context was all wrong. That photograph had been taken 3 weeks ago when Jake gave her a ride to the medical clinic after her car broke down. She'd been crying because the doctor had just confirmed her worst fears. The bruises on her ribs weren't healing properly, because Thomas had cracked 2 of them during his last drunken rage. Jake had offered her a tissue and spoken quietly, reassuringly, telling her she didn't deserve what Thomas was doing to her. For just a moment, she'd felt what it was like to have someone show her genuine kindness. The photographer had captured that single moment of human connection and twisted it into something sordid. "This isn't what it looks like," Cassandra said. But her words were drowned out by the crowd's angry voices. "Adulterous, shameful woman. Poor Thomas working himself to death while she carries on." Martha stepped closer, her eyes blazing with the fervor of someone who'd found a righteous cause. "The good book says the wages of sin is death, Cassandra. Mitchell, you've brought shame on this whole community. Please let me explain. Jake was just helping me get to the doctor." "My car." "Lies," Martha spat. "Thomas showed us the other pictures too." You climbing into motels with that man, holding hands, carrying on like some common harlot while wearing a wedding ring. Cassandra's blood turned to ice. There were other pictures, but that was impossible. She'd never been to a motel with Jake Morrison or anyone else. She'd barely spoken to the man except for that one afternoon when he'd shown her kindness. She hadn't felt in years. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Thomas had set this up. Somehow her husband had manufactured evidence of an affair. That never happened, but why? What could he possibly gain from destroying her reputation, from turning their entire community against her? The answer came with Martha's next words. Thomas is filing for divorce, of course. He'll be taking the house, the land, everything. A woman who breaks her marriage vows doesn't deserve to keep what a good man worked to provide. There it was. Thomas wanted out of their marriage, but he also wanted to keep everything they'd built together. In a small town like Cedar Ridge, a man whose wife cheated on him would get sympathy, support, and in any legal proceedings, he'd be seen as the wronged party. A wife accused of adultery, on the other hand, would be lucky to leave with the clothes. On her back, the crowd was growing larger, their voices getting louder and more hostile. Cassandra could see some of the younger men exchanging glances, working themselves up to something more than just shouting. In a place where justice often came from the community rather than the courts, accusations like this had a way of escalating quickly. "I need to call a lawyer," Cassandra said, stepping backward into her house. "You need to confess your sins and ask forgiveness," Martha shot back. "Though I doubt the Lord will have mercy on someone who betrayed her marriage vows so brazenly." Cassandra closed the door and turned the deadbolt, but she knew it wouldn't hold if the crowd decided to take more direct action. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone, only to discover the line was dead. Thomas must have had it disconnected. Through the kitchen window, she could see more people arriving. Word was spreading fast in the small community, and each new arrival seemed angrier than the last. Someone had brought a camera and was taking pictures of her house. Others were setting up what looked like a picket line across her front yard. The afternoon wore on with the crowd outside growing more restless. Cassandra huddled in her bedroom, away from the windows, trying to figure out what to do. She had maybe $40 in cash, no working phone, and a car that hadn't started in 2 weeks. Even if she could somehow slip away, where would she go? Thomas had isolated her from her family over the years, convincing her they didn't care about her, that he was all she had got. As evening approached, she heard vehicles arriving with a different sound, not the family cars and pickup trucks of her neighbors, but something heavier, more purposeful. Peering carefully through a crack in the bedroom curtains, her heart nearly stopped. Thomas had returned, and he wasn't alone. Behind his truck came 2 more vehicles filled with men she recognized from the construction crews around town. Hard men who worked with their hands and settled disputes with their fists. Men who believed in old-fashioned justice for old-fashioned crimes, but it was what she saw in the back of the 3rd truck that made her legs give out. 3 large metal cages, and in each one, a hunting dog. Not pets or working dogs, but the kind of animals trained to track and bring down prey. Their eyes gleamed in the fading light, and even through the glass she could hear their low, eager whining. Thomas stepped out of his truck and surveyed the crowd like a general reviewing his troops. He'd changed clothes since leaving for work. That morning, trading his construction gear for clean jeans and a pressed shirt. He looked like a man preparing for an important occasion. Martha Hendricks approached him, and they spoke in low voices for several minutes. Cassandra couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see Thomas nodding, his expression grave and righteous. He was playing the part of the wounded husband perfectly, accepting the community's sympathy with just the right mix of dignity and pain. The crowd parted as Thomas walked toward the house. His boots sounded heavy on the wooden porch steps, each footfall like a nail being driven into a coffin. When he knocked on the door, it It was with the authority of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Cassie, open up. We need to talk." She pressed herself against the bedroom wall, as if distance could somehow protect her from what was coming. "I know you're in there. The whole town knows what you've done, but I'm willing to be reasonable about this. Open the door, and we can discuss terms." Terms, like she was a business transaction gone bad, rather than the woman he'd promised to love and honor. "I also know you're thinking about running," Thomas continued, his voice carrying easily through the thin walls. "But where exactly do you think you're going to go? No car, no money, no friends left in this town. And even if you did somehow get away, those pictures are going to follow you wherever you land. Good luck explaining those to the next man foolish enough to trust you." The cruelty in his voice was nothing new, but hearing it in front of the entire community felt different. This wasn't the private Thomas who raged and struck, and then apologized with tears and promises. This was Thomas performing for an audience, playing the role of a man driven to extremes by his wife's betrayal. "Here's what's going to happen, Cassie. You're going to come out here and publicly confess what you've done. You're going to apologize to me and to this community for the shame you've brought on all of us. Then you're going to sign the divorce papers and transfer your share of the property to me. Do that, and you can leave here with your dignity intact." Cassandra almost laughed at the absurdity of it. What dignity? He'd already destroyed her reputation with fabricated evidence. He'd turned her neighbors into an angry mob. And now he was offering her a chance to preserve dignity she no longer possessed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "The alternative," Thomas continued, "is that we handle this the old way. The way communities used to deal with women who couldn't keep their marriage vows. I've got some friends here who are happy to help make sure you understand the seriousness of what you've done." The crowd murmured agreement, and Cassandra heard someone shouting about teaching lessons and upholding community standards. The voices were getting uglier, more aggressive. The kind of mob mentality that could turn deadly if given the right push. "You've got 10 minutes to decide," Thomas announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "After that, I can't be responsible for what happens. This community has standards, and when someone violates those standards, sometimes the community has to take action." Cassandra sank to the floor, her back against the bedroom wall, and tried to think. Every option seemed to lead to the same destination: her complete destruction. If she confessed to crime she hadn't committed, she'd lose everything and be branded as an adulteress for the rest of her life. If she didn't, the mob outside would take matters into their own hands. The sound of the dogs was getting louder, their whining more excited. Someone was letting them out of their cages. She thought about Jake Morrison, the man whose kindness had been twisted into evidence of her guilt. Where was he now? Did he know what his moment of compassion had cost her? Would he even care, or would he, like everyone else, believe the lies and turn away? 7 minutes left. The bedroom window faced the back of the house, away from the crowd. If she could somehow slip out without being seen, she might be able to make it to the Rocky Hills. Behind the property. It would mean leaving with nothing but the clothes on her back, becoming a fugitive from her own life. But it was better than facing whatever Thomas had planned. She was reaching for the window latch when she heard the first dog howl, not the excited whining from before, but the deep, hunting call of an animal that had caught his scent. Then another dog joined in, and another, until the desert air was filled with the sound of the pack announcing they were ready for the chase. 5 minutes left. Cassandra closed her eyes and tried to remember a prayer from childhood, something her grandmother had taught her about finding strength in desperate times. But the words wouldn't come. All she could hear was the growing excitement in the voices outside, the scrape of boots on gravel, the metallic sound of truck tailgates being lowered. Time was running out, and she was out of options. Whatever happened next, her old life was over. The question now was whether she'd have any chance at a new one. 3 minutes left. She opened the window. The desert floor felt like broken glass beneath Cassandra's bare feet as she dropped from the bedroom window into the gathering darkness. She'd managed to grab a pair of shoes and a jacket, but in her haste, she'd forgotten socks, and every step sent sharp pains shooting up her legs. Behind her, the angry voices of the mob grew louder, more impatient. "Time's up." Thomas's voice boomed across the night air. "She's made her choice." The sound of splintering wood told her they were breaking down the front door. In seconds, they'd realize she was gone, and then the real hunt would begin. Cassandra pressed herself against the back wall of the house, trying to disappear into the shadows while figuring out her next move. The rocky hills behind her property stretched for miles, full of canyons and caves where someone could hide if they knew the terrain well enough. Unfortunately, she didn't. Thomas had never allowed her to explore beyond their immediate property, claiming it was too dangerous for a woman alone. Now she was about to find out just how dangerous it really was. The first shout came from inside the house. Someone had discovered the open window. Flashlight beams began sweeping the backyard, and she heard Thomas barking orders like a military commander. "Jackson, take your dogs around the south side. Miller, you and your boys check the north. She can't have gotten far on foot." The dogs were being released from their cages, their excited barking filling the air with predatory hunger. These weren't tracking dogs used for search and rescue. These were hunting animals, trained to bring down prey and hold it until their masters arrived. The distinction would matter greatly in the coming hours. Cassandra forced herself to move, even though every instinct screamed at her to freeze and hide. The nearest cover was a cluster of Joshua trees about 50 yards away, but reaching them would mean crossing open ground where the flashlights could easily spot her. She had no choice but to try. Staying low, she began to run. The desert scrub tore at her jacket and pants, and twice she nearly fell over hidden rocks. The shoes she'd grabbed were house slippers, useless for this kind of terrain, but better than nothing. Behind her, the voices were getting more organized, more systematic. They were spreading out to cover all possible escape routes. She reached the Joshua trees, just as the first flashlight beam swept across the area where she'd been moments before. Her lungs burned from the sprint, and she had to bite her lip to keep from gasping audibly. The voices were closer now, and she could hear individual conversations. "Carl, you see anything over there?" "Nothing yet, but the dogs are picking up something. They're heading toward the back hills." "Good, she probably thinks she can hide in the rocks until morning." Show her how wrong she is. The casual cruelty in their voices chilled her. These were men she'd known for years, people who'd seemed decent and neighborly in daily life. Now they were talking about hunting her down like she was some kind of dangerous animal that needed to be eliminated. A new voice joined the conversation, one she recognized with a sick feeling in her stomach. Jake Morrison had arrived. "What the hell is going on here, Thomas? I just got your message about some kind of emergency." "Jake, perfect timing. We're dealing with a situation involving your girlfriend here." "My what? What are you talking about?" Thomas's voice took on a tone of mock sympathy. "I know this is hard to hear, buddy, but we've got proof that your business partner's wife has been carrying on with you. Pictures, witnesses, the whole thing. The community's decided it's time for some old-fashioned justice." The silence that followed was deafening. Cassandra could imagine Jake's confusion, his mind trying to process what he was being told. He was a good man. She'd seen that in his eyes during their brief encounter. But he was also outnumbered by an angry mob that had already made up its mind about what was happening. "Thomas, I gave your wife a ride to the doctor 3 weeks ago. That's it. If someone's been spreading stories about anything more than that, they're lying." "Save it, Jake. We've got photographs." "Photographs of what?" Her crying in my truck because she was scared to go home? Because that's what I remember from that day. The words hit the mob like cold water. Several voices started talking at once, confusion replacing certainty. But Thomas was ready for the challenge. Nice try, but adultery is adultery. The evidence speaks for itself. Now you can either help us bring her in, or you can be considered part of the problem. It was a masterful move. By threatening Jake directly, Thomas was forcing him to choose between his own safety and defending a woman he barely knew. Most men would take the smart path and walk away. Cassandra closed her eyes, preparing to hear Jake's footsteps retreating toward his truck. Instead, she heard something that made her heart skip a beat. You're all out of your mind. I'm not part of whatever vigilante nonsense this is, and I'm sure as hell not going to stand by while you terrorize an innocent woman. Innocent? Martha. Hendrick's voice cut through the night like a blade. We have photographic evidence of her shameful behavior. You have a picture of me being kind to someone who was hurt and scared. If that's evidence of adultery in your twisted minds, then you're all sicker than I thought. The crowd's mood was shifting, but not in the direction Cassandra had hoped. Jake's defense of her was only making them angrier, more convinced that they were dealing with a conspiracy between adulterous lovers. That's enough, Thomas announced. Jake, you've got 30 seconds to get in your truck and drive away. After that, we're going to assume you're part of this, and we'll deal with you accordingly. Go to hell, Thomas. I'm calling the sheriff. The sheriff's in Phoenix at a conference. Won't be back until tomorrow. Looks like it's just us and some good old-fashioned community justice. Cassandra heard the sound of a cell phone being dialed, then Jake's frustrated curse. No signal. Convenient. Cell tower has been having problems all week, Thomas said with false sympathy. Guess we'll have to handle this ourselves. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Jake's presence had complicated things for the mob, but it had also made them more dangerous. Now they had 2 targets instead of 1, and their leader was clearly prepared to eliminate anyone who got in his way. The dog's barking was getting closer, more exciting. They definitely picked up her scent and were following the trail she'd left. In the darkness, she could see flashlight beams moving through the scrub brush, methodically searching every possible hiding place. She had to keep moving. The next cluster of cover was a dry creek bed about 100 yards further into the hills. If she could reach it without being spotted, she might be able to follow it deeper into the canyon system, where the terrain would make it harder for the dogs to track her. But the distance seemed impossible. Too much open ground, too many opportunities to be seen. A gunshot cracked through the night air. The flashlight beams stopped moving, and for a moment, the desert fell silent except for the sound of barking dogs. Then Thomas's voice boomed across the landscape. That was a warning shot, Cassandra. We know you're out there, and we know you can hear me. You've got one last chance to come back and face this with some dignity. Keep running, and we'll let the dogs handle it their way. Another gunshot, this one closer to where she was hiding. The message was clear. They weren't just hunting her anymore. They were hurting her, trying to drive her in a specific direction where they could corner her more easily. Jake's voice cut through the darkness, and she could hear the anger in it. You're all insane. This is kidnapping, assault, terroristic threatening. Every one of you is going to prison for this. Only if someone lives to tell the tale, came a voice she didn't recognize. And right now, that's looking less and less likely. The threat was unmistakable. They weren't just planning to teach her a lesson anymore. They were talking about eliminating witnesses to their vigilante justice. Jake's noble attempt to defend her had signed his own death warrant. Cassandra made her decision. She couldn't let an innocent man die because he'd shown her kindness. If she was going to run, she had to create a distraction that would draw attention away from Jake and give him a chance to escape. She picked up a rock about the size of a baseball. and hurled it as hard as she could toward the south side of the search area. It crashed into a pile of metal debris someone had dumped years ago, creating a loud clatter that echoed across the desert. "There! South side by the old dump." Flashlight beams swung toward the sound, and she heard boots running across the rocky ground. The dogs' barking intensified as they were redirected toward the false trail. It would only buy her a few minutes, but maybe that would be enough for Jake to get away. She was wrong about Jake's intentions. Instead of using the distraction to escape, he was moving in her direction. She could see his silhouette against the starlight, crouched low and moving carefully through the scrub brush. He was trying to find her, to help her somehow. Even though it put him in greater danger, the realization hit her like a physical blow. This man, who barely knew her, was risking his life to protect her from a mob that included his own business partner. He was choosing to do what was right instead of what was safe, and it was going to get him killed. The search party was spreading out again, their initial excitement over the false trail fading as they realized they'd been fooled. The dogs were sniffing around the debris pile, confused by the lack of human scent. It wouldn't be long before they picked up her real trail again. Jake was close enough now that she could whisper without being overheard by the others. "Jake, over here." He turned toward her voice, and she saw his face clearly for the first time since this nightmare began. There was no fear in his expression, only determination and something that might have been protective anger. "Are you hurt?" he whispered as he reached her hiding spot. "No, but you need to get out of here. They're talking about killing both of us now. I'm not leaving you alone with these lunatics. You don't understand. Thomas set this whole thing up. The pictures, the accusations, everything. He wants me gone so he can take everything I own. This was never about adultery. It was about money and property." Jake's jaw tightened. "I figured as much. Thomas always was a greedy bastard, but I never thought he'd go this far. He's desperate. The construction business has been losing money for months. I think he owes people, dangerous people, and he needs my half of the property to pay them off. Then we need to get you somewhere safe so you can tell that story to the authorities." "Where?" "He said the sheriff won't be back until tomorrow. And even if we could reach him, who's going to believe me against all these witnesses?" Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking. In the distance, they could hear Thomas reorganizing the search, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "Spread out wider. She's got to be somewhere in this area. And keep an eye out for Jake. He's helping her now, which makes him just as guilty. There's an old mining camp about 5 miles north of here," Jake whispered. "Been abandoned for decades, but there's still a cabin that's mostly intact. If we can make it there, we can hole up until morning and figure out our next move. 5 miles in this terrain? The dogs will catch us long before we get there. Not if we're smart about it. I know these hills better than any of them do. There's a dry riverbed that runs most of the way. The dogs will have trouble tracking us over the rock, and we'll be hidden from their flashlights." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. The alternative was to wait in the Joshua trees until the search party inevitably found them, and then face whatever old-fashioned justice Thomas had in mind. "Why are you doing this?" Cassandra asked. "You could still get away. Tell them you couldn't find me and just leave." Jake looked at her with those same kind eyes she remembered from their brief encounter weeks ago. "Because you didn't deserve what happened to you then, and you don't deserve what's happening to you now. Sometimes a man has to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous." The dogs were getting closer again, their barking more focused and determined. The false trail had only delayed them temporarily. Now they were back on the real scent and closing in fast. "We have to go now," Jake said, helping her to her feet. "Stay close, step where I step, and whatever happens, don't look back." They slipped away from the Joshua trees, just as the first dog rounded the corner where they'd been hiding moments before. The animal's howl of discovery echoed across the desert, immediately answered by the excited calls of the rest of the pack. There! The dogs found something! Flashlight beams converged on their former hiding spot, and angry voices filled the air as the mob realized their prey had slipped away again. But now they had a fresh trail to follow, and the hunters were closing in with renewed determination. Jake led her toward what looked like empty desert, but as they got closer, she could see the depression in the ground that marked the ancient riverbed. It was deeper than she'd expected, deep enough to hide them from casual observation, but not so deep that they couldn't climb out if they needed to. The rocky bottom was treacherous in the darkness, covered with loose stones that threatened to turn ankles or send them tumbling into hidden crevices. But Jake moved with the confidence of someone who'd explored this terrain before, and she did her best to follow his lead. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were getting organized and systematic. Thomas was good at this. He'd turned an angry mob into an efficient hunting party, complete with dogs, firearms, and enough local knowledge to cut off most escape routes. "How much further?" she whispered. "About 4 miles. We'll be okay once we reach the narrow part of the canyon. The dogs won't be able to follow our scent through the rock formations there." 4 miles of broken terrain in the darkness, pursued by armed men and hunting dogs. It seemed impossible, but the alternative was unthinkable. They pressed on through the night, 2 desperate people fleeing toward an uncertain refuge, while behind them, the sounds of the hunt grew ever closer, the ancient riverbed carved through the desert like a wound in the earth, its walls rising higher as Jake and Cassandra descended deeper into the canyon system. The rocky bottom made their progress slow and treacherous, but it also muffled the sound of their footsteps and made tracking more difficult for the pursuing dogs. Jake moved with surprising grace for such a large man, his boots finding solid footing on surfaces that would have sent most people tumbling. Cassandra struggled to keep up, her house slippers offering little protection against the sharp stones and thorny desert plants that lined their path. "Here," Jake whispered, stopping suddenly and reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a small LED flashlight, cupping his hand around it to create just enough light to see the immediate terrain ahead. "We need to move faster, but I don't want you breaking an ankle in the dark." The narrow beam revealed a landscape that seemed alien in the pale light, twisted rock formations carved by centuries of flash floods, creating a maze of passages that branched off in multiple directions. Without someone who knew the terrain, it would be easy to get lost in the labyrinth and wander in circles until dawn. "You really know where you're going?" Cassandra asked, wincing as another sharp stone found its way through her thin solace. "I spent a lot of time out here as a kid. My uncle had a small ranch about 10 miles north, and I used to explore these canyons every summer. Found some interesting things over the years: old mining equipment, Native American artifacts, places where you could hide from the world if you needed to." There was something in his voice that suggested he'd needed to hide from the world more than once. Cassandra wanted to ask about it, but the sound of barking dogs echoing through the canyon reminded her that their conversation would have to wait. The pursuit was still following them, but the sounds were more distant now, distorted by the canyon walls. Thomas's voice could be heard occasionally, shouting orders to his men, but the words were unclear. The rocky terrain was doing its job of slowing down the hunting party. "They're having trouble with the dogs," Jake observed, pausing to listen. "Scent doesn't hold well on stone, and the canyon walls are confusing the echoes. They're not sure which direction we went. How long before they figure it out?" "Depends on how smart Thomas is feeling tonight. If he splits his men up to check all the different passages, he'll spread them too thin to be effective. If he's patient and systematic, he'll eventually find the right trail." They pressed on through the winding canyon, the walls growing taller and narrower around them. In some places, the passage was so tight they had to turn sideways to squeeze through. In others, it opened into small chambers where pools of water had collected from recent rains. creating oases of life in the desert wasteland. It was in one of these chambers that they encountered their first real obstacle. The passage they'd been following split into 3 different directions, each tunnel disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow Jake's flashlight beam. Worse, the sound of running water echoed from somewhere ahead, suggesting that recent rains had created streams that might be too deep or fast to cross safely. Which way? Cassandra asked. Jake played his light over each opening, studying the rock formations and the debris that had collected at the entrances. The left passage leads back toward town. We'd be walking straight into Thomas's hands. The right one goes deeper into the mountains, but it's a dead end about 2 miles in. The middle passage is our best bet, but what? It goes through Devil's Throat. Even in the darkness, she could see the concern on his face. That doesn't sound promising. It's a narrow canyon with walls about 60 feet high. Only one way in, one way out. If they catch us in there, we'll be trapped like rats in a pipe. The sound of voices echoed through the canyon behind them, closer than before. The hunting party had made better time than expected, and they were gaining ground. We don't have much choice, Cassandra said. They're going to catch us if we stay here. Jake nodded grimly. Devil's Throat it is. But I need to warn you, there's a reason they call it that. The passage is so narrow in places that a heavy rain can turn it into a death trap. Water comes rushing through like a freight train, and there's nowhere to go but up. Any chance of rain tonight? He looked up at the star-filled sky, clear as far as I can see. But the weather changes fast in the desert. They entered the middle passage, their footsteps echoing eerily in the confined space. The walls pressed in on both sides, and the ceiling was so low in places that Jake had to duck to avoid hitting his head. The sound of their breathing seemed amplified in the narrow confines, making Cassandra worry that their pursuers would hear them coming from miles away. The passage wound back and forth like a snake, sometimes opening into small chambers, sometimes narrowing to shoulder width. In the deepest parts, Jake's flashlight revealed ancient petroglyphs carved into the rock walls, symbols and figures left by people who had walked this same path centuries ago. Look at this, Jake whispered, stopping at one particularly elaborate carving. The beam revealed a scene of figures running from what looked like a great flood, with wavy lines representing rushing water filling the canyon. A warning, Cassandra realized. They're telling future travelers about the danger of flash floods. The Native Americans who lived here knew every secret of this desert. They wouldn't have carved this warning unless people had died in this canyon. The sobering thought followed them as they continued deeper into Devil's Throat. The walls rose higher with each step, until they were walking through a corridor of stone that blocked out most of the starlight. Only Jake's small flashlight beam kept them from complete darkness. Halfway through the passage, they heard the sound that Jake had been dreading, a low rumble echoing through the canyon behind them, growing louder by the second. What is that? Cassandra asked, but even as she spoke, she knew the answer. The rumble had the deep, overwhelming quality of massive amounts of water moving through stone. Flash flood, Jake said, his voice tight with controlled panic. There must have been a storm somewhere upstream. We've got maybe 5 minutes before it hits. 5 minutes to traverse what remained of Devil's Throat, or find some way to get above the flood line. In the narrow beam of the flashlight, Cassandra could see that the canyon walls were smooth and nearly vertical. No handholds, no ledges, no way to climb to safety. Can we make it through? She asked, already knowing the answer from his expression. Not at the pace we've been going. We'd need to run, and this terrain is too dangerous to run on in the dark. The rumble was getting louder, and now they could hear other sounds mixed in with it, the crash of rocks being tumbled by the rushing water, the groan of debris being swept along by the flood. It sounded like a freight train bearing down on them at full speed. Jake played his flashlight over the canyon walls, searching desperately for any crack or crevice that might offer salvation. The beam swept back and forth, revealing nothing but smooth stone carved by countless floods over the millennia. "There!" he suddenly exclaimed, the light focusing on a spot about 15 feet up the canyon wall. "It's not much, but there's a ledge. If we can reach it, we might be able to ride out the flood." The ledge was barely wide enough for one person, let alone two, and getting to it would require a climb that would be challenging even under good conditions. In the dark, with a flash flood approaching, it seemed almost impossible. "You go first," Jake said, already moving toward the wall. "I'll boost you up, then follow. What if you can't make it? Then at least one of us survives to tell the story." The rumble was becoming a roar now, and they could feel vibrations through the rock beneath their feet. Jake cupped his hands to create a stirrup and braced himself against the canyon wall. "Put your foot here and push off as hard as you can. Try to grab that outcropping about 10 feet up. It's not much, but it might hold your weight long enough to reach the ledge." Cassandra placed her foot in his hands, and he launched her upward with surprising strength. Her fingers scraped against the rock face, searching for any kind of grip. The outcropping he'd pointed out was just within reach, but when she grabbed it, loose stone crumbled away in her hands. She slid back down, landing hard against Jake's chest. "I can't do it. The rock is too loose. You have to, look." He turned his flashlight toward the mouth of the canyon behind them, and what she saw made her blood freeze. A wall of water 6 feet high was rushing toward them, carrying with it debris field of uprooted trees, boulders, and what looked like pieces of buildings from somewhere upstream. "Try again," Jake said urgently. "This time, don't trust the outcropping. Go for the crack in the wall about 2 feet to the left. It's narrow, but it might give you enough grip to pull yourself up." The roar of the approaching flood was deafening now, drowning out almost everything else. Cassandra could feel spray on her face from the churning water, still hundreds of yards away but approaching with terrifying speed. She placed her foot in Jake's hands again, and this time when he launched her upward, she ignored the obvious handholds and went straight for the crack he'd identified. Her fingers found the narrow fissure in the rock and held, supporting her weight long enough to get her feet braced against the wall. From there, it was a desperate scramble up the sheer face, her fingernails breaking against the stone as she clawed her way toward the ledge. Behind her, she could hear Jake grunting with effort as he tried to follow, but she didn't dare look back. Her hand touched the ledge. Just as the flood hit, the sound was indescribable, like standing next to a waterfall, a tornado, and a freight train all at once. The entire canyon shook with the force of the rushing water, and debris crashed against the walls with impacts that felt like explosions. She hauled herself onto the narrow ledge and immediately reached down for Jake. He was about 5 feet below her, pressed against the wall as the flood roared past just inches from his boots. His flashlight was gone, swept away by the torrent, leaving them in complete darkness except for the occasional flash of lightning from the storm clouds that had appeared overhead. "Grab my hand," she shouted over the roar of the water. "I can't reach. The current's too strong." The water level was rising rapidly, and she could see that Jake was running out of handholds. In another minute or two, the flood would reach his position, and the force of the water would tear him away from the wall. Without thinking, she swung her legs over the edge of the ledge and lowered herself as far as she could while still maintaining her grip on the solid rock above. Her outstretched hand was now within 2 feet of Jake's position. "Now," she yelled. "Jump for it." Jake looked up at her, and even in the darkness, she could see the doubt in his eyes. If he missed her hand, the flood would sweep him away instantly. If he grabbed her, but she couldn't hold on, they'd both be pulled into the raging torrent, but the alternative was certain death. He jumped. His hand caught hers just as the rising water reached his boots. The sudden weight nearly pulled her from the ledge, but somehow she managed to hold on. her other hand gripping the rock with desperate strength. For a terrifying moment, they hung, suspended over the flood, Jake dangling from her grip, both of them seconds away from being swept away by the churning water. Then, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, Cassandra began pulling them up. Inch by inch, handhold by handhold. They climbed toward the narrow ledge that represented their only hope of survival. The flood raged beneath them, carrying with it the debris of the storm's destruction upstream. Trees that had stood for decades, boulders the size of cars, and man-made objects that had been torn from their foundations. All of it swept past in the churning brown water. They reached the ledge just as the flood crested, the water level rising to within a few feet of their precarious perch. They pressed themselves against the canyon wall, barely breathing as the torrent thundered past below them. "How long do these floods usually last?" Cassandra asked when the roar subsided enough for conversation. "Depends on the storm. Could be an hour, could be all night. But there's something else we need to worry about." "What now?" Jake pointed back toward the mouth of the canyon, where flashlight beams were visible in the distance. "Thomas and his men. They're still coming, and when they find this canyon blocked by flood water, they're going to know exactly where we are." The realization hit her like a physical blow. They'd escaped the immediate threat of the flood, but in doing so, they'd trapped themselves in a canyon with only one way out. When the water receded, they'd be sitting ducks for the hunting party. "Is there another way out of here?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Not from this ledge. We'd have to go back down and through the canyon, which means waiting for the flood to pass completely. By then, Thomas will have the exit covered." They were trapped, hanging on a narrow ledge in a canyon that would soon become their tomb. The flood had saved them from immediate capture, but it had also sealed their fate, unless Jake had one more trick up his sleeve. "Actually," he said slowly, playing his flashlight beam over the canyon walls above them, "there might be one possibility. It's crazy dangerous, but it might work." "What is it?" "There's an old mining tunnel that runs through the mountain about 30 feet above us. If we can reach it, it comes out on the other side of the ridge, miles from where Thomas expects us to be." Cassandra looked up at the smooth canyon wall stretching endlessly above them. "How exactly do we get 30 feet higher when we can barely hold onto this ledge?" Jake's flashlight beam revealed a series of natural cracks and ledges that formed a rough ladder up the canyon wall. It would be a treacherous climb, made more dangerous by the darkness and the loose rock, but it was possible. "We wait for the flood to pass, then we climb. It's either that, or we surrender to Thomas and hope he's feeling merciful." Given what she'd seen of her husband's capacity for cruelty, mercy seemed unlikely. The climb might be dangerous, but it was their only real chance at escape. Below them, the flood continued its relentless passage through Devil's Throat, carrying away the last remnants of their old lives and forcing them toward a future neither of them could have imagined just hours before. The flood waters receded as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving behind a canyon floor scoured clean of debris and glistening with wet mud under the starlight. The silence that followed the thunderous roar was almost more unsettling than the chaos had been, too complete, too ominous. Jake checked his watch by the dim glow of his backup flashlight. 3 hours until dawn. "We need to move now if we're going to reach that mining tunnel before Thomas figures out where we went." The climb to the tunnel entrance would take them directly above the canyon floor, where their pursuers would soon be searching. If they were spotted during the ascent, they'd be completely exposed, perfect targets silhouetted against the rock face with nowhere to run. "What's our story if they catch us?" Cassandra asked, testing her grip on the first handhold. "We don't get caught." Jake's voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. "Because if we do, there won't be anyone left to tell stories." The initial part of the climb was deceptively manageable. The ledges were wide enough to provide solid footing, and the handholds, while weathered, felt secure. But as they climbed higher, the rock face became more challenging, the hold smaller, and less reliable. 20 feet up, Cassandra's foot slipped on a patch of loose stone, sending a shower of pebbles rattling down into the canyon below. They both froze, listening for any indication that the sound had attracted attention. In the distance, they could hear voices. The hunting party had reached the canyon entrance and was assessing the flood damage. "Damn it," came Thomas's voice, carrying clearly in the still air. "The whole canyon's flooded out. They could be anywhere downstream." "Maybe they drowned," suggested another voice, one Cassandra recognized as belonging to Pete Williams, who owned the hardware store in town. "Don't count on it. Jake knows these canyons better than most. He'd have found somewhere to ride it out." The conversation continued below as the search party spread out along the canyon rim, but Jake and Cassandra had no choice but to keep climbing. Every movement sent small stones cascading down, but the sounds were masked by the searchers' own movement and conversation. 30 feet above the ledge where they'd sheltered from the flood, Jake's flashlight beam found what they'd been looking for: a dark opening in the canyon wall, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. The entrance to the old mining tunnel was hidden behind a curtain of desert vines and accumulated debris from decades of abandonment. "There," he whispered, pointing to the opening. "But getting to it is going to be the tricky part." The final approach required traversing a nearly vertical section of rock face with minimal handholds. One wrong move would send them plummeting back down to the canyon floor, directly into the path of their pursuers. Jake went first, testing each hold carefully before committing his full weight to it. His movements were deliberate and methodical, the actions of someone who understood that patience was the difference between life and death. Cassandra followed his exact path, placing her hands and feet in the same positions he'd used. The tunnel entrance was even smaller than it had appeared from below. Jake had to clear away decades of accumulated debris before they could squeeze through the opening. The smell that emerged was musty and stale, carrying hints of old timber and rusted metal from the mining equipment that had been abandoned inside. "How far does this tunnel go?" Cassandra asked as they crawled into the darkness. "About half a mile through the mountain. It was part of a copper mining operation that went bust in the 1920s. The miners hit a vein that played out after just a few months, so they abandoned the whole operation. The tunnel was barely wide enough for them to crawl through single file. The walls were rough-hewn rock supported by wooden timbers that creaked ominously as they passed. In several places, cave-ins had partially blocked the passage, forcing them to squeeze through openings that seemed impossibly narrow. Jake's flashlight revealed the detritus of the abandoned mining operation: rusted tools, rotted lengths of rope, and the skeletal remains of what had once been a minecart. The air grew thicker as they progressed deeper into the mountain, heavy with dust and the smell of decay. "Are you sure this tunnel actually goes all the way through?" Cassandra asked, trying to keep the claustrophobia out of her voice. "I explored it once when I was about 16. Made it about 3/4 of the way before I got spooked and turned back. But the maps I found in the old mine office showed it connecting to the main shaft on the other side of the ridge. Maps from the 1920s weren't exactly reliable guidance for a life-or-death escape, but they were committed now." Behind them, the tunnel entrance was already lost in darkness, and ahead stretched an unknown distance of cramped, dangerous passage through the heart of the mountain. The tunnel began to slope downward, and they could hear the sound of dripping water echoing in the darkness ahead. Jake's flashlight beam revealed that the passage opened into a larger chamber, partially flooded with groundwater that reflected their light like a black mirror. "We'll have to wade through," Jake said, playing his light across the water's surface. "Looks like it's only a couple feet deep, but we need to be careful. Water this far underground can be colder than you expect, and hypothermia can set in fast." The water was shockingly cold, immediately soaking through their shoes and sending icy jolts up their legs. The bottom was uneven, covered with loose rocks and mining debris that made each step treacherous. Halfway across the flooded chamber, Cassandra stepped on what felt like solid ground, only to have her foot plunge through into a hidden cavity that nearly sent her tumbling. Face first into the frigid water. Jake caught her arm, steadying her as she regained her balance. Old mine shafts. The whole floor down here is probably riddled with them. We need to test each step. The crossing took 20 minutes of careful progress, but they finally reached the far side of the chamber, where the tunnel continued its passage through the mountain. The passage was drier here, but also more unstable. Several times they had to crawl under partial cave-ins where the wooden support timbers had finally succumbed to decades of pressure from the rock above. It was during one of these crawls that they heard the sound that made both their hearts stop, voices echoing through the tunnel behind them. They definitely came this way. Look at these fresh footprints in the mud. How the hell did they even find this place? Jake Morrison knows every cave and crevice in these mountains. Should have figured he'd head for somewhere like this. Thomas's voice carried clearly through the confines of the tunnel. The hunting party had found the entrance and was following their trail through the mountain. The head start they'd gained was evaporating rapidly. Can we move faster? Cassandra whispered. Not without making noise they'll hear. This tunnel carries a sound like a megaphone. They pressed on as quickly as they dared, but the sounds of pursuit were getting closer. The searchers weren't bothering with stealth anymore. They knew their quarry was trapped in the tunnel with nowhere else to go. Jake Morrison. Thomas's voice boomed through the passage. I know you can hear me. This tunnel's a dead end, and you know it. The main shaft on the other side collapsed years ago. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. If Thomas was right, if the far end of the tunnel was blocked, then they just crawled into their own tomb. There would be no escape, no way out except back through the entrance where armed men were waiting for them. He's lying, Jake said, but Cassandra could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He's just trying to get us to give up. How can you be? Sure, I can't. But we don't have any choice except to keep going and hope for the best. They reached another chamber, this one larger than the flooded area, but filled with a maze of mining equipment and support structures that created a confusing labyrinth of shadows in Jake's flashlight beam. Old mine carts sat on rusted rails that disappeared into side passages. Wooden platforms and ladders led to upper levels where miners had followed promising veins into dead ends. This is it, Jake said, recognizing the chamber from his teenage exploration. The main passage continues straight ahead, but there are also several side tunnels that might lead to other exits. I never explored them all. Some of them could be escape routes the miners built in case of cave-ins. Others might just be dead ends that'll get us lost in the mountains. The sound of their pursuers was getting closer, echoing through the tunnel system as the hunting party made better time through passages that had already been cleared of debris. They had minutes at most before the searchers reached this chamber. Jake played his flashlight beam over the various tunnel entrances, trying to remember details from his exploration decades earlier. 3 passages led deeper into the mountain, each looking equally dark and uninviting. The main tunnel goes straight through, he said, pointing to the largest opening. But if Thomas is right about the collapse, we'll hit a dead end. What about the others? The one on the left slopes upward, might lead to a surface exit somewhere on the ridge. The one on the right goes down, probably connects to lower levels of the mine. It was an impossible choice. Split up and one of them might find an escape route while the other walked into a trap. Stay together and they might all end up cornered in a dead-end tunnel with no way out. The decision was made for them by the sound of flashlight beams sweeping the entrance to the chamber. The hunting party had reached their position. Left tunnel, Jake whispered urgently. If it goes up, it has to lead somewhere. They slipped into the upward-sloping passage, just as the first searcher entered the main chamber. The tunnel was narrower, Then the main shaft, barely wide enough for them to walk upright, but it was definitely climbing toward the surface. Behind them, they could hear Thomas organizing the search of the chamber. Check every tunnel. They can't have gotten far. The upward tunnel wound back and forth through the mountain, sometimes opening into small natural caverns, sometimes narrowing to passages that required them to squeeze through a single file. Air grew fresher as they climbed, carrying hints of sage and desert wind that suggested they were approaching the surface. Jake's flashlight began to dim, the battery finally succumbing to hours of continuous use. They were climbing mostly by feel now, following the upward slope and hoping it would lead them to freedom rather than another dead-end dot. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they saw it, a faint glimmer of starlight, filtering down from above. The tunnel ended at a vertical shaft that led up to the surface, its walls lined with rusted ladder rungs that had somehow survived decades of abandonment. "That's got to be 50 feet straight up," Cassandra said, looking. "At the distant opening, at least. And those ladder rungs look like they could give way at any moment." They could hear voices echoing through the tunnel system below them, getting closer as the searchers systematically checked each passage. There was no time for careful consideration of alternatives. "You go first," Jake said. "Test each rung before you put your full weight on it. If one breaks, don't panic. Just find the next solid one and keep climbing." The rusted ladder felt treacherous under her hands, each rung threatening to crumble away at the slightest pressure. But one by one, she made her way up the shaft toward the circle of starlight that represented freedom. Behind her, she could hear Jake following, his heavier weight making the ancient metal groan with each step. 30 feet up, her hand closed on empty air where a rung should have been. A 10-foot section of the ladder had rusted away completely, leaving a seemingly impossible gap to cross. Below her, Jake's flashlight beam revealed that the shaft walls were smooth rock with no handholds. "I can't make it across," she called down softly. "There's no way to bridge the gap." But Jake was already moving, positioning himself directly below her and bracing his feet against opposite walls of the shaft. "Step on my shoulders," he said. "I can get you high enough to reach the next section of ladder." It was a desperate maneuver that required perfect balance and timing. If either of them slipped, they'd both fall 50 feet to the rocky bottom of the shaft. But with the sounds of pursuit getting closer every minute, it was their only option. Cassandra carefully positioned her feet on Jake's shoulders, using his solid frame as a human ladder to reach the intact rungs above the gap. From there, she was able to continue her climb toward the surface, leaving Jake stranded below with no way to follow. "Keep going," he called up to her. "Get out and find help. Don't worry about me." But Cassandra was already working on a solution. At the surface, she found what she was looking for, a length of old mining cable that had been left near the shaft opening. It was corroded and frayed, but it might be strong enough to support Jake's weight for the few seconds it would take him to cross the gap. She lowered one end of the cable down the shaft, anchoring the other end around a boulder near the opening. Jake caught the cable and tested its strength, knowing that his life depended on its integrity. The climb out of the mining shaft brought them to a ridge overlooking a vast expanse of desert that stretched to the horizon under the star-filled sky. They were miles from Cedar Ridge, far from the hunting party that was still searching the tunnels below. For the first time since the nightmare began, they were truly free, but freedom came with its own challenges. They had no transportation, no supplies, and no way to contact the outside world for help. The nearest town was probably 50 miles away across some of the most unforgiving terrain in Arizona. "Where do we go from here?" Cassandra asked, looking out at the endless desert. Jake pointed toward a faint glow on the horizon. "There's a truck stop about 20 miles east. If we can make it there, we can call the state police and tell them what really happened." 20 miles across the desert with no water, no proper shoes, and a head start that was shrinking every minute they stood still. It seemed impossible, but then again, everything about this night had seemed impossible. "Are you ready for a long walk?" Jake asked. Cassandra looked back at the mining shaft that had been their salvation, then out at the desert that represented their future. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than what they'd left behind. "Lead the way," she said. The desert stretched before them like an ocean of shadows and silver, the rocky terrain broken by patches of sagebrush and the occasional silhouette of a Joshua tree against the star-filled sky. 20 miles to safety seemed like 20,000 as they began their trek across the unforgiving landscape. Jake set a steady pace, choosing their route carefully to avoid the worst of the rocky outcroppings while staying away from the obvious paths that their pursuers might follow. His knowledge of the terrain was their greatest asset. He knew where to find the hidden water sources, which areas to avoid due to unstable ground, and how to read the subtle signs that would keep them moving in the right direction. "Tell me about this truck stop," Cassandra said as they navigated around a field of barrel cacti, their spines glinting dangerously in the starlight. "Bailey's Junction. It's been there since the 1950s, serving the long-haul truckers and the occasional tourist who gets lost trying to find the main highway. The owner, Maria Bailey, is a good people. She won't ask too many questions, and she's got a phone we can use to call for help. What if Thomas thinks to check there? He might eventually. But it'll take him hours to organize a search of the whole area, and by then we'll have contacted the authorities. Once the state police are involved, Thomas won't be able to control the narrative the way he did with the local community." They walked in silence for a while, conserving energy and focusing on the challenging terrain. The temperature was dropping as the night progressed, and Cassandra found herself shivering despite the physical exertion of the hike. Her house slippers had disintegrated miles ago, leaving her feet vulnerable to the sharp stones and thorny plants that seemed to cover every surface. "Here," Jake said, stopping suddenly and shrugging out of his jacket. "You need this more than I do." "I can't take your jacket. You'll freeze. I've spent plenty of nights in the desert. I know how to stay warm. Besides, those clothes you're wearing aren't exactly designed for wilderness survival." She accepted the jacket gratefully, immediately feeling the warmth from his body heat that still clung to the fabric. It smelled of honest work and sage smoke, a comforting contrast to the sterile cologne that Thomas favored. As they continued their journey, Jake began to share stories of his childhood explorations in the desert, partly to keep their minds off the discomfort of the hike, but also to help Cassandra understand the landscape they were traversing. He pointed out landmarks invisible to untrained eyes, the way certain rock formations indicated underground water sources, how the growth patterns of desert plants revealed the safest paths through dangerous terrain. "My uncle taught me most of this," he said as they paused to rest beside a small natural spring hidden among the rocks. "He was a geologist who came out here in the 1960s looking for mineral deposits. Never found much copper or silver, but he learned to read the desert like other people read books. What happened to him? Cancer about 10 years ago. Left me the ranch and everything he'd learned about surviving in a country like this. I always figured I'd pass it on to my own kids someday, but..." He trailed off, and Cassandra sensed there was a story there he wasn't ready to share. Instead, she focused on the spring, cupping the clear water in her hands and drinking deeply. It was ice cold and tasted faintly of minerals, but it was the most refreshing thing she'd ever experienced. "We can't stay here long," Jake said, checking his watch. "Dawn's only a couple hours away, and once the sun comes up, we'll be visible for miles. We need to reach Bailey's Junction while we still have the cover of darkness." They pressed on through the desert, their pace quickened by the approaching deadline. The terrain grew more challenging as they moved away from the familiar mining country into areas that showed signs of recent flash flood activity. Dry creek beds carved deep gouges through the landscape, and the rocky ground was littered with debris carried down from the mountains. It was while crossing one of these flood zones that they encountered their first sign that they weren't alone in the desert. Jake stopped suddenly, holding up his hand for silence. In the distance, barely visible against the dark landscape, a pair of headlights was moving slowly across their path. The vehicle was too far away to identify, but its movement pattern suggested it was searching rather than simply traveling through the area. Could be anyone, Cassandra said hopefully. Maybe someone who could help us, or it could be Thomas. He's got friends with off-road vehicles, and he knows these back roads as well as anyone. We can't take the chance. They watched from concealment as the vehicle made several passes through the area, its headlights sweeping back and forth like the beam of a lighthouse. The driver was definitely searching for something, and given their situation, it was reasonable to assume that something was them. We'll have to go around, Jake decided. It'll add at least 5 miles to our route, but it's safer than trying to cross while they're patrolling the area. The detour took them through some of the most difficult terrain they'd encountered yet. A maze of rocky canyons and steep-sided arroyos that forced them to backtrack repeatedly when they hit dead ends. The extra distance and the challenging navigation cost them precious time, and by the time they were able to resume their eastward course, the sky was already beginning to lighten on the horizon. How much further? Cassandra asked, her voice tight with exhaustion and pain. The makeshift shoes Jake had fashioned for her from strips of his shirt were better than nothing, but they offered little protection against the punishment her feet were taking. Maybe 8 miles. But we're going to have to be more careful now. Daylight means we can be spotted from a lot further away. As if to emphasize his point, the sound of engines echoed across the desert from multiple directions. The search had expanded, with what sounded like at least 3 vehicles now combing the area. The coordination suggested this wasn't a random patrol. Thomas had organized a systematic search grid that would eventually cover every possible escape route. There. Closing in, Cassandra observed, counting the distant engine sounds. Not if we're smart about it. See that ridgeline ahead? If we can reach it before full daylight, we can follow it most of the way to Bailey's Junction while staying out of sight. The race against the rising sun became a desperate scramble across increasingly open terrain. They moved from cover to cover, timing their movements to avoid the search vehicles while making steady progress toward the protective ridgeline. Several times they had to drop flat against the ground as headlights swept across their position, holding their breath until the danger passed. The eastern sky was painted in shades of pink and gold by the time they reached the base of the ridge. Their goal so close they could almost taste the safety it represented. But the final approach would require crossing a quarter-mile of completely open ground, with no cover except a few scattered boulders. "Wait here," Jake said, studying the terrain. "Ahead. I'm going to scout the route and make sure it's clear. We should stay together. If something happens to me, you need to be free to make a run for it. Bailey's Junction is straight east from here. Follow that ridgeline and you can't miss it." Before she could protest, he was gone, moving with surprising stealth across the open ground. Cassandra watched his progress from concealment, her heart in her throat every time he had to cross an exposed area where the searchers might spot him. He was halfway to the ridgeline when everything went wrong. A vehicle she hadn't seen, one that must have been lying in wait with its engine off, suddenly roared to life from a position near the base of the ridge. Spotlights blazed across the desert, immediately finding Jake's position and pinning him in their brilliant glare. "There he is." The voice carried clearly across the still morning air. "Jake Morrison, you're surrounded. Give yourself up." More vehicles converged on the area, their engines growing louder as they closed in from multiple directions. Jake was caught in the open with nowhere to run, the spotlights following his every movement as he tried desperately to reach cover. Cassandra watched in horror as the trap closed around the man who had risked everything to protect her. She could see Thomas's truck leading the convoy, its distinctive chrome bumper reflecting the spotlight beams as it bounced across the rough terrain. The vehicles formed a rough circle around Jake's position, their occupants shouting orders and threats as they dismounted with weapons drawn. From her hiding place, Cassandra could see at least a dozen men, all armed, all focused on the lone figure caught in their lights. "Where's the woman?" Thomas's voice boomed across the desert. "We know she's out here somewhere." Jake's response was lost in the distance, but his body language made it clear he wasn't cooperating. Even captured and outnumbered, he was still trying to protect her. "Search the area," Thomas commanded. "She can't have gotten far." The search party began spreading out, working systematically through the scattered cover where Cassandra might be hiding. She had maybe 10 minutes before they reached her position, and after that, there would be nowhere left to run. The smart thing to do would be to abandon Jake and make a desperate run for Bailey's Junction. She might make it. The searchers were focused on the area around their captive, and she had enough of a head start to possibly outrun their pursuit. It was what anyone with sense would do. Instead, she found herself moving toward the confrontation. She couldn't abandon the man who had saved her life, who had risked everything on the word of a woman he barely knew. If they were going to be captured, at least they'd face it together. But as she got closer, she realized that surrender might not be an option. The mood of the search party was ugly, their voices carrying the kind of excitement that came from successfully hunting dangerous prey. These weren't men planning to turn prisoners over to the authorities. They were planning to dispense their own version of justice. "Jake Morrison," Thomas was saying as she crept close enough to hear the conversation clearly. "You've caused me a lot of trouble tonight. Helped my lying wife make a fool of me in front of the whole community. Made me look weak. The only one who made you look weak is you, Thomas. Your wife never cheated on you, and you know it. Evidence says otherwise. And when we find her body out here in the desert, it'll look like you both died trying to run from your crimes. Tragic ending to a sordid affair." The casual mention of finding her body made Cassandra's blood run cold. This wasn't about justice or community standards anymore. This was about eliminating witnesses to Thomas's lies. He was planning to kill them both and make it look like an accident. She needed a weapon, a distraction, something that would give Jake a chance to escape. In the growing daylight, she could see the search vehicles more clearly, and one detail caught her attention. Thomas's truck was parked on the edge of a steep slope, its emergency brake the only thing keeping it from rolling down into a deep arroyo. The plan that formed in her mind was desperate and dangerous, but it might create enough chaos for Jake to get away. Moving carefully to stay out of sight, she worked her way around the perimeter of the search area until she was positioned behind Thomas's truck. The emergency brake lever was visible through the driver's side window, which had been left partially open. If she could reach it without being detected, she might be able to send the heavy vehicle rolling down the slope and into the group of searchers. She was reaching for the brake lever when a hand grabbed her shoulder. Well, look what we have here." Carl Henderson, one of Thomas's construction workers, had spotted her approach and circled around to cut off her escape. His grip was like iron as he hauled her to her feet, his weathered face split by a triumphant grin. "Thomas," he called out, "I found her." All eyes turned toward them as Carl marched her into the circle of vehicles, his hand firmly gripping her arm. The faces surrounding her showed a mixture of anger, disgust, and anticipation, the expressions of people who had convinced themselves they were about to witness righteous justice. "Cassandra," Thomas said, his voice carrying mock sympathy, "you've led us quite a chase. Cost us a whole night's sleep and put the entire community through unnecessary worry. The only thing the community should be worried about is having a liar and a criminal for a neighbor." She shot back, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Still denying the evidence of your adultery? Even with your lover standing right there? Jake Morrison is not my lover. He's a decent man who tried to help someone in trouble. Something you wouldn't understand." Thomas's face darkened at the insult, and she could see the violence building behind his eyes. This was the expression she'd learned to fear during their marriage, the look that preceded his worst rages. "Tie them both up," he ordered. "We'll take them back toward town and arrange for an appropriate accident. Something that explains why 2 adulterers died together in the desert." As the men moved to follow his orders, Cassandra caught Jake's eye and mouthed a single word: "Run." He shook his head almost imperceptibly. Even facing certain death, he wasn't going to abandon her, but fate intervened in the form of a sound that made everyone freeze, the distant wail of sirens approaching fast from the direction of the main highway. Someone had called the authorities, and help was finally on the way. "How?" Thomas demanded, his carefully planned execution suddenly thrown into chaos. That the answer came from an unexpected source: Maria Bailey, climbing out of an old pickup truck that had approached unnoticed during the confrontation. "I called them," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with troublemakers. "Jake Morrison's been coming to my place for 15 years, and I know a good man when I see one. When he didn't show up for his usual coffee this morning, I figured something was wrong." The elderly woman surveyed the armed men with obvious disgust. "Looks like I was right." The sirens grew louder by the second, their wailing echoes bouncing off the canyon walls and filling the desert air with the promise of salvation. But Thomas Mitchell wasn't the kind of man who surrendered easily, especially when everything he'd worked for was about to crumble around him. "Everyone back to your vehicles," he barked, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "We're leaving, now." "What about them?" Carl Henderson asked, still gripping Cassandra's arm. "They're coming with us. We'll figure out the rest later." Maria Bailey stepped forward, her weathered hands planted firmly on her hips. Despite being outnumbered by a dozen armed men, she showed no fear. "You're not taking anybody anywhere, Thomas Mitchell. Those sirens belong to state police units, and they'll be here in about 3 minutes. You want to add kidnapping to whatever charges you're already facing? The only charges anyone's facing are adultery and public disturbance." Thomas shot back, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "These 2 have been carrying on behind my back, and the community has a right to demand justice." "Justice?" Maria's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You call hunting people through the desert with dogs justice? You call threatening to kill innocent folks justice? Son, you've lost your mind if you think any court's going to see it that way." The sound of the approaching vehicles was getting closer, accompanied by the distinctive hump of helicopter rotors. Someone had called in serious backup, and Thomas's carefully orchestrated vigilante operation was about to become a major law enforcement incident. "Boss, we need to go," urged Pete Williams, already backing toward his truck. "If the state boys catch us here with weapons drawn, we're all looking at felony charges." The other members of the search party were having similar thoughts. What had seemed like righteous community action in the darkness now looked like a criminal conspiracy in the harsh light of dawn. One by one, they began retreating toward their vehicles, their enthusiasm for Thomas's cause evaporating as reality set in. But Thomas wasn't ready to let his carefully constructed plan fall apart. He pulled a revolver from his jacket and pointed it directly at Jake's chest. "Nobody moves until I say so," he announced. "We're going to wait right here and explain to the police how we caught 2 adulterers trying to flee the scene of their crimes." "Thomas," Jake said quietly, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at him, "you're making this worse for yourself. Put the weapon down and we can all walk away from this." "Walk away? After what you've cost me. My marriage, my reputation, my standing in the community. All destroyed because you couldn't keep your hands off another man's wife. I never touched your wife, and you know it. This whole thing is a lie you've constructed to cover up your own failures." The accusation hit its mark. Thomas's face flushed with rage and his grip on the revolver tightened. My failures? I worked 16-hour days to build a life for that ungrateful woman. I gave her everything she could want. You gave her bruises and fear, Cassandra said, finding her voice despite the gun now swinging in her direction. You gave her a prison disguised as a marriage. I gave you discipline when you needed it, structure, a man's guidance to keep you from making foolish mistakes. You gave me hell on earth, and when I finally found someone who showed me kindness, you twisted it into something ugly to justify stealing everything I owned. The truth hung in the desert air between them, exposed and undeniable. Even the remaining members of the search party were beginning to understand that they'd been manipulated into supporting a domestic abuser's elaborate revenge scheme. The first state police vehicle crested the ridge, its emergency lights painting the rocks in alternating patterns of red and blue. The officer behind the wheel took in the scene, armed civilians surrounding two people who were obviously prisoners, with one man pointing a gun at the captives. The police vehicle's PA system crackled to life. This is the Arizona State Police. Everyone on the ground now. Drop your weapons immediately. Instead of complying, Thomas grabbed Cassandra and pulled her against him, using her as a human shield while keeping the gun trained on Jake. Stay back, he shouted. This is a domestic matter. These two are criminals fleeing justice. More police vehicles were arriving, followed by the helicopter that had been tracking them. Within minutes, the desert clearing was surrounded by law enforcement officers taking defensive positions behind their vehicles. The situation had escalated from a community dispute to a potential hostage crisis. Sir, release the woman and put down your weapon, came the amplified voice of the lead. Negotiator, we can resolve this peacefully. There's nothing to resolve, Thomas yelled back. I'm a victim here. These two destroyed my marriage and fled when the community tried to hold them accountable. Maria Bailey, who had been quietly observing the standoff, stepped forward with her hands clearly visible. Officer, my name is Maria Bailey. I own Bailey's Junction truck stop, and I can provide some context for what's really happening here. The lead officer, a sergeant with 20 years of experience written in the lines around his eyes, gestured for her to approach his position. Maria walked calmly through the tense scene, ignoring the armed civilians and the helicopter circling overhead. These people have been running for their lives all night, she explained to the sergeant. That man with the gun is Thomas Mitchell, and he's been hunting his own wife through the desert because she tried to leave him. The other man, Jake Morrison, tried to help her escape. Do you have evidence to support that claim? Jake's been coming to my place for coffee every morning. For 15 years. He's never missed a day unless he was out of town on business. When he didn't show up this morning, I knew something was wrong. Then I started getting radio chatter from truckers who'd seen vehicles racing through the desert with spotlights, and it sounded like a manhunt. The sergeant spoke into his radio, calling for additional backup and requesting a domestic violence specialist. The situation was becoming clearer, but Thomas still had a hostage and showed no signs of surrendering. Mr. Mitchell, the negotiator, called out, "We're going to need you to release Mrs. Mitchell so we can sort this out safely. No one wants anyone to get hurt here. She's not going anywhere until you people understand what really happened." Thomas's voice was becoming more erratic, the pressure of the situation breaking down his carefully maintained facade. "She's an adulteress. The whole community can testify to that." "What community?" Jake asked, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Look around, Thomas. Where are all your supporters now?" It was true. Of the dozen men who had participated in the night's hunt, only 3 remained. The others had fled when the police arrived, unwilling to face arrest for their role in what was clearly revealed as a vigilante operation. Even those who remained were backing away from Thomas, distancing themselves from a man who was rapidly revealing himself to be unhinged. The mob mentality that had sustained the night's events was evaporating in the face of legitimate authority and harsh daylight reality. "They know the truth," Thomas insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "They've seen the evidence." "What evidence?" Cassandra demanded, surprising everyone with the strength in her voice. "Show them these photographs you claim to have. Let the police examine them and determine if they're real or fabricated. I don't have to prove anything to you." "Actually, you do," the police sergeant called out. "If you're claiming to be the victim of a crime, we'll need to see your evidence. But first, you need to put down that weapon and release the woman." Thomas's grip on the revolver was becoming unsteady, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The elaborate plan he'd constructed was collapsing, and he was facing the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. "I want to make a deal," he announced suddenly. "I'll release her, but I want guarantees that my side of the story gets heard." "Your side will be heard," the negotiator assured him. "But we need to defuse the situation first. Release Mrs. Mitchell and put down your weapon, and we can discuss everything calmly." For a long moment, Thomas seemed to consider the offer. Then his expression hardened, and Cassandra felt his grip on her tighten. "No deals," he said. "If I'm going down, I'm taking them with me." The words sent a chill through everyone present. This was no longer about community justice or marital disputes. This was a man preparing to commit murder rather than face the kill. Consequences of his actions, Jake took a step forward, drawing Thomas's attention away from the police. "Thomas, think about what you're doing. Is this really how you want your story to end? As the man who murdered innocent people because he couldn't face the truth about himself? Innocent?" Thomas's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You destroyed my life, both of you. You destroyed your own life with lies and violence. We're just the people you're trying to blame for your choices." The helicopter circling overhead was joined by news helicopters, their cameras capturing every moment of the standoff. The story was going out live to television audiences across the state, ensuring that whatever happened next would be witnessed by thousands of people. The pressure seemed to break something in Thomas's mind. With a wordless roar of rage, he shoved Cassandra away and raised his gun toward Jake. What happened next occurred in the space of heartbeats. Jake dove to the side as Thomas fired, the bullet whining past his ear to strike the rocks behind him. Before Thomas could fire again, Cassandra threw herself at his gun arm, knocking his aim wide as he squeezed the trigger a second time. The police response was immediate and overwhelming. Sniper fire from multiple positions struck Thomas in the shoulder and leg, dropping him to the ground as officers rushed in to secure the scene. Within seconds, the gun was kicked away and Thomas was in custody, bleeding but alive. "Are you hurt?" Jake asked, reaching Cassandra just as she collapsed from exhaustion and shock. "I'm okay," she managed, though her voice was barely a whisper. "Is it over?" "It's over," he confirmed, helping her to her feet as paramedics rushed toward them. "It's finally over." The aftermath moved with the efficient chaos of a major crime scene. Thomas was treated for his wounds and taken into custody, while Jake and Cassandra were checked by paramedics and interviewed by detectives. The remaining members of the search party were arrested and questioned about their role in the night's events. As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, the full scope of Thomas's deception began to emerge. A search of his truck revealed sophisticated photo editing equipment and printed copies of the fabricated images he'd used to prove his wife's adultery. His computer contained evidence of financial problems far worse than anyone had suspected, including debts to dangerous people who had been pressuring him for payment. The community members who had participated in the hunt were charged with various crimes ranging from assault to kidnapping, but most would eventually receive reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony about how Thomas had manipulated them into believing his lies. "What happens now?" Cassandra asked as they sat in the back of an ambulance, waiting to be transported to the hospital for a more thorough examination. "Now you get to start over," Jake replied. Build the life you want instead of the one someone else chose for you. What about you? Your business partnership with Thomas is obviously finished. I've been thinking about going into business for myself anyway. Maybe it's time to take that step. Maria Bailey appeared at the ambulance door, her weathered face creased with concern. How are you two holding up? We'll be fine, Jake assured her, thanks to you. If you hadn't called the police. Don't mention it. I've seen enough troubled souls come through my place over the years to recognize the real thing when I see it. You two take care of each other, you hear? As the ambulance pulled away from the scene, Cassandra looked back at the desert where they'd fought for their lives. The landscape that had seemed so threatening in the darkness now appeared peaceful under the morning sun, its harsh beauty unmarred by the human drama that had played out across its surface. You saved my life, she said to Jake. You saved mine. Right back there at the end. I guess that makes us even. Jake smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since the nightmare began. I guess it does. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with legal proceedings and the challenging work of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by lies and violence. But for the first time in years, Cassandra felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope for a future where she could be safe, respected, and free to make her own choices. The cowboy had kept his promise. She was safe now, and the nightmare was finally over. 3 months after that night in the desert, Cassandra Mitchell stood before Judge Elena Rodriguez in the Maricopa County Courthouse, surrounded by boxes of evidence that would seal Thomas. Mitchell's fate. The man who had once controlled every aspect of her life now sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his empire of lies crumbling under the weight of forensic evidence and witness testimony. Your Honor, District Attorney Patricia Hawkins addressed the court. The state has uncovered a pattern of domestic abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy that spans several years. Mr. Mitchell orchestrated an elaborate scheme to frame his wife for adultery in order to steal her property and eliminate witnesses to his crimes. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members from Cedar Ridge, and law enforcement officials who had worked the case. Many of the same neighbors who had participated in the desert hunt now sat in the gallery, their faces etched with shame and disbelief at how thoroughly they'd been manipulated. Cassandra glanced at Jake, who sat in the front row directly behind her. His presence had been a constant source of strength throughout the legal proceedings, even though their relationship remained carefully platonic while the case worked its way through the courts. The media attention had been intense, with some outlets trying to sensationalize their story as a forbidden romance. But they'd both been careful to keep the focus on the real issues: domestic violence, community responsibility, and the power of truth over deception. The defendant's computer forensics reveal extensive use of photo manipulation software. Day Hawkins continued, along with financial records showing debts totaling over $400,000 to various creditors, including organizations with known criminal connections. When his construction business began failing, Mr. Mitchell saw his wife's property as his salvation, and he was willing to commit any crime necessary to acquire it. Thomas's attorney, a young public defender named Marcus Webb, had done his best with an impossible case. Your Honor, my client acknowledges that he made serious errors in judgment. However, the state's characterization of these events as premeditated conspiracy. Counselor, Judge Rodriguez interrupted. Your client organized a vigilante hunt through the desert with armed civilians and hunting dogs. He fabricated evidence of adultery using sophisticated computer manipulation. He attempted to murder 2 people to cover up his crimes. What part of this strikes you as an error in judgment rather than premeditated conspiracy? Webb had no good answer. The evidence was overwhelming, documented not just in digital forensics, but in the testimony of dozens of witnesses who had slowly come forward as the truth emerged. The community that had once rallied to Thomas's cause now stood united in their condemnation of his actions. Dr. Sarah Chun, The neighbor who had initially shunned Cassandra had become one of the most vocal advocates for domestic violence awareness. In Cedar Ridge, her testimony about the pressure Thomas had applied to convince the community of his wife's guilt had been particularly damning. He presented it as protecting community values, she had testified the previous week. He made us feel like we were standing up for what was right. In reality, he was manipulating our trust to turn us into accessories to his crimes. The psychological evaluation of Thomas had revealed a narcissistic personality disorder, coupled with severe financial anxiety, that had driven him to increasingly desperate measures. Dr. Michael Garrett, the court-appointed psychiatrist, had described a man who viewed other people as objects to be manipulated for his own benefit, incapable of genuine empathy or remorse. Mr. Mitchell, Judge Rodriguez addressed the defendant directly. Do you wish to make a statement before sentencing? Thomas rose slowly, his lawyer's hand on his arm in a gesture of restraint. For a moment, it seemed he might offer some word of apology or acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused. Instead, his face hardened with the same self-righteous anger that had driven his actions from the beginning. I was trying to save my marriage, he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. Everything I did was to protect what I'd built, to maintain the stability of my household. If that woman had been a proper wife, none of this would have happened. The words hit Cassandra like physical blows, not because they hurt, but because they revealed how completely unchanged Thomas remained. Even facing decades in prison, he was incapable of accepting responsibility for his choices. Judge Rodriguez's expression grew stern. Mr. Mitchell, you've just demonstrated exactly why this court has no choice but to impose the maximum sentence allowable under law. Your complete lack of remorse, your continued blame of the victim, and your utter failure to understand the gravity of your crimes make you a clear and ongoing danger to society. The judge's gavel came down with finality. Thomas Mitchell, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in state prison for conspiracy, kidnapping, attempted murder, domestic violence, and fraud. You will serve this sentence without possibility of parole for the first 15 years. A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. It was over. Thomas was led away in shackles, his face finally showing the first crack in his composure as the reality of his situation sank in. Outside the courthouse, Cassandra found herself surrounded by reporters shouting questions about her plans, her relationship with Jake, and her thoughts on the sentence. She'd prepared a brief statement with the help of her attorney, focused on the broader issues the case had highlighted. No one should have to flee for their life because they want to escape an abusive marriage, she read from her prepared notes. No community should allow itself to be manipulated into participating in vigilante violence. I hope our story helps other people recognize the warning signs and speak up before tragedies occur. The questions continued, but Jake appeared at her side and skillfully guided her through the crowd toward a waiting car. Their escape route had been planned in advance, designed to avoid the media circus that had surrounded every court appearance. How are you holding up? He asked once they were safely away from the courthouse. Better than I expected. It feels surreal that it's actually finished. What's next for you? It was a question she'd been grappling with for months. The legal proceedings had consumed her life, but now she faced the challenge of building something new from the wreckage of her old existence. The property settlement had left her financially secure. Ironically, Thomas's attempt to steal her assets had resulted in her gaining full ownership of everything they'd built together. I've been thinking about starting a foundation, she said. Something to help other women in situations like mine. Provide legal assistance, safe housing, maybe even self-defense training. That sounds like important work. What about you? Any regrets about getting involved in this mess? Jake was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. The only regret I have is that it took so long for someone to help you. If I'd paid more attention to the signs earlier, maybe we could have prevented some of what happened. You. Can't save everyone, Jake, but you saved me, and that matters more than you know. The construction business he'd started after breaking ties with Thomas was already showing promise. Word had spread about his role in exposing the truth, and many contractors in the area specifically sought him out because of his reputation for integrity. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Thomas's attempt to destroy Jake's livelihood had actually enhanced his standing in the community. They drove through Cedar Ridge on their way to Maria Bailey's truck stop, where a small celebration was planned, with the people who had supported them throughout the ordeal. The town looked different now, the same buildings and streets, but somehow cleaner, as if the truth had washed away years of accumulated lies and suspicion. Many of the businesses displayed small signs supporting domestic violence awareness, a community-wide acknowledgement of how they'd been complicit in perpetuating Thomas's abuse through willful blindness. The local church had started a support group for abuse survivors, and the sheriff's department had implemented new training on recognizing and responding to domestic violence situations down at Bailey's Junction. Maria had prepared a feast that seemed disproportionate to the small group gathered, but her generosity had always run toward excess. The guest list was deliberately small. Just the people who had stood by them when standing by them was dangerous. Dr. Chun was there with her husband, both of them having become strong advocates for changing how the community responded to domestic violence. Sheriff Deputy Raymond Parks, who had pushed for a more thorough investigation when the case first broke, raised a toast to the power of persistence in pursuit of truth. To second chances, he said, lifting his beer bottle, and to people brave enough to do what's right, even when it's hard. The celebration was subdued but meaningful, more relief than jubilation. They'd all learned something about themselves. During the crisis, some things they were proud of, others they wished they could change. But the important thing was that they'd learned, and they were committed to doing better in the future. As evening approached, Jake and Cassandra found themselves sitting on the porch of the truck stop, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The landscape that had been the scene of so much terror now looked peaceful again, reclaimed from the violence that had temporarily scarred it. "I keep thinking about that first night," Cassandra said, "when you made that choice to help me instead of walking away. What made you do it? Honestly, I'm not sure I can explain it. Something about the way you looked in that truck when I gave you the ride to the doctor. Like you were carrying the weight of the world and afraid to let anyone see it. I recognized that look. From where? My mother. She had the same expression for years before she finally found the courage to leave my father. I was too young to help her then, but I promised myself I'd never ignore that look again if I saw it." It was the first time he'd shared that part of his history, and it explained a lot about his willingness to risk everything for someone he barely knew. His intervention hadn't been random kindness. It had been the fulfillment of a promise made to himself years earlier. "Did she make it out okay, your mother?" "Eventually. It took her 3 tries, but she finally got away when I was 16. Moved U.S. to California, where she had a sister who could help. She's got a small flower shop in Sacramento now, happier than I ever saw her when I was growing up." "Does she know about what happened here?" "I called her after the trial ended. She said she was proud of me for keeping my promise." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibilities that hadn't existed just months earlier. They weren't a couple in any traditional sense. The circumstances of their meeting made romantic involvement complicated at best. But they were friends, allies, and survivors of something that had tested them both in ways they never could have imagined. "There's something I want to ask you," Jake said eventually. "What? The foundation you mentioned. Would you consider letting me help with it? I don't know much about legal advocacy or counseling, but I could handle construction work, maybe help build safe houses or renovation projects." Cassandra turned to look at him, seeing in his weathered features the same kindness that had first saved her life. Are you sure? It would mean a long-term commitment, probably years of difficult work. I'm sure. Some promises you make to other people, and some you make to yourself. This feels like both. Then yes, I'd be honored to have your help. The partnership they were discussing was professional, but it represented something deeper. A shared commitment to ensuring that what had happened to them wouldn't happen to others. It was a way of transforming their trauma into something positive, a method of healing that involves helping others heal. As they drove back toward town later that evening, Cassandra realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. The nightmare was finally over, but more importantly, a new chapter was beginning, when she would write herself, on her own terms, surrounded by people who respected her autonomy and supported her choices. The desert stretched endlessly around them, vast and indifferent and beautiful under the star-filled sky. It had been the setting for the worst night of her life, but it had also been the place where she discovered reserves of courage she never knew she possessed. In the end, it had become not a symbol of her helplessness, but a testament to her strength. Jake had kept his promise that night in the canyon. She was safe now. But more than that, she was free. And she was determined to use that freedom to ensure others could find the same safety and liberation. The cowboy's promise had been fulfilled, but the work it inspired was just beginning. 2 years had passed since that fateful night in the desert, and the Haven Foundation stood as a testament to how tragedy could be transformed into hope. The sprawling complex on the outskirts of Phoenix housed emergency shelters, legal aid offices, counseling centers, and a vocational training facility that helped domestic violence survivors rebuild their lives from the ground up. Cassandra walked through the main building's bright corridors, reviewing the final preparations for today's dedication ceremony. Governor Patricia Williams would be cutting the ribbon, alongside representatives from law enforcement agencies across Arizona who had partnered with the foundation to improve their response to domestic violence cases. The transformation had been remarkable, both in the foundation and in Cassandra herself. Dawn was the frightened woman who had once cowered in the shadows of an abusive marriage. In her place stood a confident advocate whose testimony before the state legislature had helped pass 3 major pieces of domestic violence legislation. The media trucks are starting to arrive, Jake reported, appearing in the doorway of her office. His own transformation had been equally striking. The struggling cowboy had become the foundation's operations director, overseeing construction projects that had expanded their facilities to serve over 200 families at any given time. Any word from the documentary crew? They're setting up in the main conference room. Director says they want to interview you about the long-term impact, but they'll work around the ceremony schedule. The documentary about their story had premiered at the Sundance Film Festival 6 months earlier, winning awards for its unflinching examination of how entire communities could become complicit in domestic abuse. The filmmakers had followed their journey from the courthouse trials through the foundation's establishment, creating a powerful narrative about resilience and redemption. I still can't believe Netflix picked it up for distribution, Cassandra said, straightening a photo on her desk that showed the foundation's first graduating class of survivors who had completed their job training program. Believe it, last I heard, it's been viewed by over 10 million people worldwide. That's 10 million people who now understand what domestic violence really looks like, and how communities can either enable it or stop it. The global reach of their story had brought unexpected opportunities. Speaking engagements at universities, consulting work with international human rights organizations, and partnerships with foundations in other countries dealing with similar issues. What had begun as a local tragedy had become a catalyst for change on a scale neither of them had imagined possible. Maria Bailey arrived for the ceremony, wearing her best dress and a proud smile that could light up the desert. At 73, she'd become an unofficial grandmother to every survivor who passed through the foundation's doors. providing the kind of unconditional support that many had never experienced. "You two clean up nice," she said, admiring their formal attire. "Hard to believe you're the same folks I found half dead in the desert that morning." "Some days it feels like that happened to different people," Cassandra admitted. "Like we're living someone else's life now." "You're living the life you were meant to live," Maria corrected. "The life you earned through courage and determination. Don't ever forget that." The ceremony itself was a celebration not just of the Foundation's work, but of the broader changes that had rippled out from their story. Cedar Ridge had become a model community for domestic violence prevention, with mandatory training for all public employees and a zero-tolerance policy for any form of victim blaming. Dr. Sarah Chun, now serving on the Foundation's board of directors, introduced the keynote speaker, Detective Lisa Rodriguez from the Phoenix Police Department, who had pioneered new protocols for investigating domestic violence cases, based on lessons learned from Thomas Mitchell's manipulation of his community. "The Mitchell case taught us that abusers don't operate in isolation," Detective Rodriguez told the assembled crowd. "They create entire systems of enablers and accomplices, often without those people even realizing what they're supporting. Our job as law enforcement has evolved to include education and prevention, not just response after the fact." When it came time for Cassandra to speak, she looked out at an audience that included many familiar faces from Cedar Ridge, people who had once participated in the hunt against her, but who now worked tirelessly to prevent such tragedies from occurring again. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the crowded auditorium. "It means choosing to build something better from the ruins of what was destroyed. Every person in this room represents a choice to learn from past mistakes and do better in the future." She spoke about the survivors the Foundation had helped, women like Rebecca Torres, who had escaped an abusive marriage and was now a paralegal specializing in family law; Maria Santos, whose ex-husband had stalked her for months before the Foundation security program helped her relocate safely; Amanda Wright, who had been disowned by her family for leaving her abusive spouse, but had found a new family among the Foundation's community. "The most important thing we've learned is that survival isn't enough," Cassandra continued. "Recovery means reclaiming not just your safety, but your power to shape your own destiny. Every graduate of our programs proves that victims can become victors, that trauma can become triumph." Jake's speech focused on the men's program they'd recently launched, working with abusive partners who genuinely wanted to change, while also providing support for male survivors of domestic violence, who often faced unique challenges in seeking help. "Change is possible, but only when people accept responsibility for their actions and commit to the hard work of becoming better," he said. "We can't save everyone, but we can provide resources for those ready to save themselves." The ribbon cutting was accompanied by thunderous applause and the flash of dozens of cameras. As the red ribbon fell away, the doors to the Foundation's newest facility opened to reveal a state-of-the-art crisis intervention center that would serve as a model for similar programs across the country. During the reception that followed, Cassandra found herself in conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Murphy, a researcher from Stanford University who was studying the long-term effectiveness of comprehensive domestic violence programs. "Your recidivism rates are remarkable," Dr. Murphy observed. "Less than 5% of your program graduates return to abusive relationships, compared to national averages of over 30%. What makes the difference?" "Community," Cassandra replied without hesitation. "We don't just help people escape bad situations, we help them build new lives, surrounded by people who support their autonomy and respect their choices. It's not enough to rescue someone once. You have to help them develop the tools and relationships that prevent them from needing rescue again." As the afternoon wound down, Jake and Cassandra found themselves alone in her office, looking out at the desert landscape where their story had begun. The view was peaceful now, But neither of them would ever see that terrain without remembering the night that had changed everything. "Any regrets?" Jake asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "About leaving Thomas? About the foundation? About any of it? About all of it? The whole journey from that first night to today?" Cassandra considered the question seriously. The path had been difficult, marked by trauma, legal battles, media scrutiny, and the constant challenge of building something meaningful from the wreckage of her former life. But it had also led to purpose, community, and the satisfaction of knowing that their suffering had prevented countless others from experiencing similar ordeals. "No regrets," she said finally. "I wouldn't choose to go through it again, but I'm grateful for where it led us. Even the part where we almost died in the desert? Especially that part. That's when I learned I was stronger than I ever imagined. That's when I discovered what real courage looks like." She gestured toward the wall where dozens of thank you letters from survivors were displayed. Every one of those letters represents someone who didn't have to experience what we went through because we were willing to share our story. That makes everything worthwhile. Outside, the sun was setting over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors they'd witnessed on that terrifying night 2 years earlier. But the beauty no longer felt threatening or alien. It felt like home, the foundations. Work would continue long after both of them were gone, sustained by the survivors who had found their own strength and chosen to help others find theirs. The Cowboy's promise had evolved into something larger, a commitment that extended beyond one desperate night to encompass a lifetime of service to those who needed protection and empowerment. As they locked up the building and headed to their respective cars, Cassandra realized that the most important promise hadn't been the one Jake made to her in the desert. It was the promise she'd made to herself, to never again allow fear to define her life, to use her freedom responsibly, and to ensure that her survival meant something more than just personal salvation. The desert stretched endlessly around them, vast and beautiful and full of possibilities. They had survived its harshest test and emerged not just intact, but transformed. The nightmare was long over, but the dream of a world where everyone could live free from fear and violence was just beginning. In the end, that was the greatest promise of all, that even the darkest night eventually gives way to dawn, and that courage, once discovered, becomes a light that can guide others safely home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.